Airdrops of humanitarian aid as a last resort to save Syrians. More than 500,000 people in besieged areas are in desperate need of help, but are conditions favorable to distribute aid? And with so many actors involved and different agendas, is there still a political way out of the crisis in Syria? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibault. Unrelentingly distressing and dire. That's how the United Nations describes the humanitarian situation in Syria. The fighting is making it extremely difficult for aid to reach civilians. The US, France and Britain are pushing for airdrops, but the UN says that should be a last resort and not a substitute for land deliveries. It estimates more than 500,000 people are living under siege, but some groups like the Siege Watch Project put that figure at more than 1 million. Around 500,000 people are believed to be trapped in the countryside outside the capital, Damascus. In the province of Homs, an estimated 365,000 are besieged. Then in Idlib province, there are around 20,000 people trapped without adequate access to food and medicine. And in Daraya in eastern Syria, an estimated 200,000 people are under siege. Now, the UN has accused both the government and rebels of preventing aid delivery. One of the hardest hit areas is the Damascus suburb of Daraya. For the first time in almost 4 years, an aid convoy has finally been let in. But some residents say it's not enough. Hashim Ahelbara has our reports.
This is the first aid convoy to get through to Daraya. The suburb of the capital, Damascus, has endured the longest siege since the start of the war in Syria. But as soon as the aid was offloaded, resentment was on the rise. There was medicine, but no food.
We want our kids to benefit from aid. It's not medicine that they want, they need food. The UN, if it cannot get food in, it's useless.
We are shocked. Just look. All the trucks are almost empty. Just look at the so-called UN aid. Barely 10 boxes they managed to get in. There are 15 boxes in each truck.
Mu'azzamiya is another Damascus suburb where people are at risk of starvation. It's also been besieged by government troops since 2012. The international community accuses Syrian government leaders of starving rebels to try to force them into submission.
The first convoy will include 4,500 food baskets, and today we've had 9,000 bags of flour. The quantity is acceptable, but we need the aid to be continuous and permanent.
The situation remains more difficult for thousands stranded in places such as Madaya, where people were forced to eat grass as well as cats and dogs. A few days ago, these children from Daraya took to the streets with banners that read, "We are not terrorists. We need milk and eggs. Give us something to eat." Hashim Ahbara for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's bring in our guests now for today's program. Joining us in Gaziantep, near the Turkey-Syria border, is Mohamad Katoub, an advocacy manager for the Syrian American Medical Society. In Paris, we have Ziad Majed, assistant professor of international politics at the American University of Paris and author of Syria, the Orphan Revolution. And in Tel Aviv, Michael Horowitz, lead author of a report on the Russian intervention in Syria and an analyst at the Levantine Group, which releases daily updates on the conflict in Syria. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on Inside Story. Mohamad Katoub in Gaziantep, if I may start with you. The UN Security Council is meeting on Friday to discuss aid drops. Now, we all recall that when the WFP tried to drop aid to a government-held area of Deir ez-Zor back in February, it failed. In your opinion, are aid drops in Syria today possible and practical?
Actually, regarding enhancing the situation, the humanitarian situation on the ground, airdrops will not enhance the situation in any way. We are not just talking here about some food to be delivered to the people in need inside Syria, either in the government or the non-government areas. We are talking about vaccination campaigns. We are talking about medication. We are talking about pure water, about heating in the winter, about many other resources that people need. So airdrops will not and will never be able to deliver those kind of aid. It's not practical. That's very, very clear. And actually, we as humanitarian workers believe that the declaration of the ISSG, the statements that they released on May 17th, is a very clear declaration that all the previous efforts to enhance the humanitarian access to besieged people failed. And according to UN estimation, the number of besieged people increased since last February. So now, instead of 450,000 people who were besieged in besieged location last February, now there are over 500,000. There is other 300,000 people in Aleppo are not accounted. They don't have access to medication. They don't have access to the cross-border mechanism, which was designed to provide aid to those areas.
Right.
Mari is just a few kilometers away from the cross borders, and there is 10,000 people are completely besieged, and the international community cannot get any influence on the parties on the ground to allow more aid to those people.
So a lot of people, you say, in desperate need of aid right now. If you look at the aid that's been delivered recently on the outskirts of Damascus, it's been medical aid, things like lice shampoo, I understand, and residents have expressed, of course, their frustration about this. What is the top priority right now as far as aid is concerned? What do people need the most?
Well, it's a community have been living in siege since 4 years. So you can imagine everything from the basic to the top of the needs. A very few convoys will never solve the problem. People need daily access to humanitarian aid. People need daily access to medical services, and also we need to evacuate the people who need high level of medical services. This is what people need. So very few convoys, a convoy every 4 years, like what's happened in Daraya, have very few hygiene kits, will never solve the problem, for people have been dying from starvation since years.
Okay, let's hear from Ziad Majed now in Paris. Ziad, a difficult decision for the UN, undoubtedly, as airdrops, as Mohamad said, are complicated both logistically and also politically. And there's no way to do this really without any cooperation, active cooperation from the Syrian government right now. In your opinion, is the Assad government in a mood to cooperate and compromise right now?
Well, I don't think that the Assad government is even concerned by the humanitarian needs of the population. The whole principle of the siege that was imposed on more than 500,000 people, whether in the Yarmouk camp or in Zabadani, Madaya, Ma'damiye, Daraya, in the whole Ghouta of Damascus, in areas in Aleppo, in Idlib, in many places, in Homs, of course, the whole principle is to force people to surrender. And the regime is using that policy as a punishment policy, as a kind of revenge against the population. So it's by all means a war crime. It's a violation of international law. And unfortunately, the UN responsibility is extremely important. It's not only today about dropping aid or about allowing some convoys to enter to those areas. There was a UN resolution in 2014 condemning those crimes, calling for the end of the practice of collective punishment. There is a responsibility of the international community to deal with these kind of cases. And I think instead of just debating in the UN and in the Security Council on the risks of dropping aids, it's a matter of talking politically, of forcing the Syrian government, of talking to its allies, to those that are protecting the Syrian government, especially Russia, that is present in the Security Council, in order to allow for humanitarian convoys to enter, in order to end the siege of those areas, and to change the configuration, the humanitarian one at least, if on the political level there is a dead end or they're not capable of finding a solution or a compromise. But at least on the humanitarian level, there should be, on the UN side, no tolerance of the government practices and of the government violation of international law and of war laws as well.
Michael Horowitz in Tel Aviv. Ziad mentioned the responsibility of the international community. How likely is it that Russia will use its influence on the Assad government to ensure that these airdrops, if they do happen safely and can proceed safely? How likely is that the Russians will use their leverage on the Assad government?
I think it's really unlikely. I mean, as one of your guests highlighted, the food, just like in many conflicts in the world, food has been used as a weapon by the Assad government to try and force residents of areas like Daraya to surrender. And Russia is backing Assad, and I don't see why Russia would have any interest in enforcing a humanitarian effort to try and get to these areas. And we've seen that thus far, Russia is not interested in these kind of measures. Russia is interested in something else, which is maybe a deceleration of the conflict, but the humanitarian part of the conflict is not something that Russia is concerned with.
But Michael, it was Russia that announced a 48-hour pause, a so-called regime of silence in Daraya to allow for the delivery of aid. So what are we to make that move then, if you say they're not interested in influencing the Assad regime to facilitate the delivery of aid? If they, on the one hand, announce a humanitarian pause, and on the other hand, the airstrikes are continuing in places like Idlib, what does it say about Russia's strategy? What are they playing at here?
It's actually part of their strategy, and it's been part of the regime strategy all along, which is to try and isolate these small opposition-held areas to focus on more decisive battles. And I think that we shouldn't misinterpret Russia's intention when they are trying to work toward a ceasefire or announcing the so-called regime of silence. The goal is to be able to redeploy the regime forces. We have to understand we're entering it's a conflict that has lasted years.
Yeah, it's in its sixth year now.
The army of Assad is exactly. So the forces have been depleted, and so if Assad wants to advance, he needs to make sure that some areas are in some way neutralized, and that means either defeating the opposition or having these so-called humanitarian pause. But they have nothing to do, at least in the mind of the regime and of Russia, they have nothing to do with a humanitarian gesture or something like that. It's part of a broader strategy that Russia and the regime are implementing.
I do want to talk about the broader picture in just a minute, but let's just come back to the humanitarian situation in Syria right now. And Mohamad Katoub, I know that you have teams on the ground working relentlessly to try and help people. And everyone agrees right now that ground delivery is the most effective way of providing aid. Even the UN says this. So tell us why this has not been happening. Tell us about the difficulties your teams are encountering on a daily basis in trying to reach the people affected, whether it's in government-held areas or rebel-held areas.
Actually, humanitarian access were not improved during the last few months. According to the UN records, according to UN reports, just last May, 23 requests to deliver aid to 35 communities, besieged communities inside Syria, were requested to the Syrian government. Just 15 had approval, and less than 10 could be implemented. So this is the situation. It's very clear who is rejecting aid, and if we are talking about if the international community can get influence to implement airdrops, why not implement ground deliveries instead of airdrops, which will be much more useful.
But that's proving difficult.
So it seems like there is no appetite to
Mohamad, I just want to know for our viewers,
the
where are
difficult
people...
is the reject.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make this clear so that our viewers are aware of the situation. Where are people worst off today in Syria? Are they worst off in government-held areas, in rebel-held areas, or in areas that are under control by ISIL?
Yeah, actually 47 besieged communities, 45 of them are besieged by the government. So it's very clear, and it's very clear who is rejecting the aid inside Syria. Regarding the population, more than 70% of the besieged population, according to UN reports, are besieged in non-government areas. If we account the 200,000 people besieged by both ISIS and the regime in Deir ez-Zor.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Mohamad. Let me now bring in Ziad to talk about the bigger picture. Ziad, there are lots of moving parts, of course, in this Syria war. What began as an uprising against Bashar al-Assad has now turned into a multi-sided war with various alliances that shift regularly. When you look at the bigger picture in Syria today, where would you say the balance of power is right now? Is it on the government side or on the rebel side?
Yeah, in fact, as you just said, the configuration of the conflict changed many times. After a peaceful uprising, then an armed struggle to end with dictatorship. We entered into a regionalized war, and now it's an international war. However, the international interventions in Syria, the Russian intervention, but also the Iranian intervention and the different militias that Iran mobilized and sent to Syria, led in the latest month to a balance of power that is favorable to the Assad government. In 2015, there were moments where we all felt that Assad is not only losing control of territory, but himself, he said in July 2015 that he does not have enough human resources to fight on all fronts. He lost in different areas in the south and the north. Then the Russian intervention came and saved him. And with the international community inactivity and passivity when it comes to Syria, with the United States ambiguities and withdrawal from the Syrian scene, Russia is in a way dictating the conditions of the political process and trying to gain time so that the armed forces of the regime, the Iranians and the pro-regime militias coming from Lebanon, Iraq and Afghanistan would keep progressing on the ground to create a reality, in fact, that will have its echoes on the negotiation table, where the opposition will be between Daesh and Assad, and where the whole formula that Assad himself, the Russians and many others kept repeating, that the choice in Syria is between Assad and Daesh, would become in a way reflected on the military scene. Of course, this is not the reality, because there are many other questions to be raised here. And of course, the Syrian people that many want to keep invisible is there and is resisting against Assad and Daesh. But the international community is not doing its duties, is not respecting the international charter of the United Nations. And we see how the Security Council, as in the Palestinian case, the United States used to block decisions and use veto to protect Israel from condemnations of violations of international law. Russia is doing the same now to protect the Assad regime that is committing crimes against humanity monthly.
Michael, Ziad says Russia is dictating the political process right now, but just about a month or so ago, we heard Vladimir Putin say that it was mission accomplished in Syria, that there was going to be a drawdown. What happened to that? I mean, what is the longer-term Russian strategy right now, and what were their ambitions when they entered this war?
Well, I think first, regarding the so-called Russian withdrawal, it's been mostly a PR operation, I would say. If you look at what exactly was changed in the military units that are on the ground in Syria, the first conclusion you can draw is that Russia still has most of its units that were prior to the withdrawal are still active in Syria. What it did is it basically changed some units. Let's say they took a squadron of older Soviet planes and basically in exchange for and brought down some helicopters. So Russia is still in Syria. There is no withdrawal. In terms of Russian activity, that's where it gets more interesting. There has been a decrease in Russian activity when you compare the number of airstrikes today.
I mean, just 48 hours ago, we saw intense airstrikes in places like Idlib. Can we really talk about a decrease in Russian activity?
We can talk about a decrease, but that doesn't mean that the Russian military activity are that there is no airstrikes. And we've seen Russian airstrikes in Idlib. We've seen Russian airplanes continuing to be active. But when compared to, let's say, the southern Aleppo offensive or the northern Aleppo offensive or offensives in Palmyra, it's not the same level of activity. Russia is there, and it's been there from the beginning to make sure that Assad doesn't lose. It is not there, on the other hand, to make sure that Assad wins.
Okay.
Because I think Putin is being very pragmatic. They know that they do not have the military resources to take back Syria.
Okay.
They know that this is impossible. What they want to do is make sure Assad doesn't lose, which is, I think, mission accomplished, and go for a negotiated solution in favor of Assad.
Ziad Majed, let me get your thoughts on this. As you've said yourself, we've had more than 5 years of Western inaction in Syria. Do you think today that there is still a political way out of this crisis?
Yes, I think there is always a political way if there is an international will and if there is a firm negotiation with Russia and Iran. So far, we have seen that John Kerry and the US administration have accepted most of the Russian conditions and the way Russia has been dealing with the conflict. I think today that there is a need to talk about a new political consensus in Syria, a national consensus. The Syrian opposition is also to be asked to talk about the necessity of fighting Daesh, of fighting ISIS, as a big threat for Syria and for its future. However, the only condition to make that fight against Daesh efficient and legitimate in the eyes of the Syrian people is to get rid of the Assad family that has been in place since 1970 now, and that is responsible of the current situation, of the disasters that Syria witnessed in the last 5 years. So there should be something about immunity, about the necessity of ending with dictatorship, about dealing with war crimes that happened on the Syrian ground, in order to make a war against ISIS possible and successful. Otherwise, if we trap the Syrian, if we take them hostage between two choices, either Assad or ISIS, and Assad anyway is not on his own. It's Assad with a foreign occupation to support him,
right,
meaning Russia and Iran. That will never lead to a political solution.
Okay.
They might defeat the opposition militarily, but they cannot take over Syria again, and that will keep creating problems for the future. So
Okay.
the political solution starts with the end of immunity and with the end of the regime in order to make the war against terror, as it's called, possible, and with the end of foreign occupation as well.
So you're still optimistic about a political solution. Let me bring in Mohamad Katoub now, finally, and I want to come back to the humanitarian situation, Mohamad, and how you think we can improve the humanitarian situation in Syria today. The US Senator John McCain blasted President Obama for failing to create the so-called humanitarian corridors, which would have allowed safe zones in Syria, enforced by US air power, of course, that could have prevented less suffering. Do you think that this could work in Syria today, humanitarian corridors and safe zones?
Actually, safe zone have been discussed for a long while, and there is many people who are putting obstacles to stop the safe zone, which might be a solution to protect the people inside Syria and to have a safe place for at least humanitarian workers to provide aid to the people in need. Actually, we believe that accountability for the war crimes will protect people because it will prevent the violators from doing more war crimes, like attacking hospitals and preventing humanitarian aid and using the siege as a weapon of war. We have been asking for investigation about the attacks on health facilities for a long while, led by the UN Security Council with a monitoring mechanism. We believe that this will increase the high rate of attacks on hospital, which is a hospital every 2 days last few months.
Okay.
And it was increased, it was doubled after October. So this is what what we believe will improve the humanitarian situation on the ground. Corridors is good, but if the evaluators didn't feel that there is accountability for their war crimes, they will never stop, and they will keep stopping aid from reaching the people in need, and they will keep attacking hospitals.
Thank you so very much for a very interesting discussion, gentlemen. Mohamad Katoub in Gaziantep, Ziad Majed in Paris, and Michael Horowitz in Tel Aviv. Thank you all. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, of course. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.